Kia ora tātou, nau mai hara mai. Te karakia timatanga noi anei. Hā ki roto, hā ki waho, kia tau te mauri e kokiri nei, i ngā piki, me ngā heke, ko te rangi Māori e taku i rapu nei, tihei mauri ora. Nau mai hara mai tātou ki tēnei wānanga. Welcome. I hope that you're beaming in, wherever you're beaming in, you're all safe and sound, and really looking forward to our session today with Claire Charters. So hopefully you're here to hear about the state of Indigenous human rights, and please refresh yourself with the Community Code of Conduct that was part of the registration requirement for this wānanga. We're hoping to have a very good dialogue this morning, and we're hoping to leave about 20 minutes for people's questions as well. There's a moderator on hand. Please put your questions into the Q&A, or you can put them into chat, and we do have a moderator, Michelle, who's in the background helping us run this session. Also, thanks to Josh and Fiona, who are also here providing some tech support. I have the privilege of introducing, oh, sorry, yes. How many more? Have we got another slide there? Oh, you can interact with one another. And yeah, is that? Yep, ka pai. So Indigenous rights are not an optional extension of human rights. Indigenous rights are human rights. They're foundational to the pursuit of justice and legitimacy in modern states. And in this session today, Dr. Claire Charters will have a dialogue about how international and constitutional law can both constrain and enable Indigenous aspirations. And she's drawing on really her vanguard work in this space across Aotearoa and in international contexts, through the lens of Te Tiriti and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, as you'll hear us say probably throughout this session. Claire examines how law and governance can be reimagined to reflect the authority, values and worldviews of Indigenous peoples. She's going to highlight some of the tensions, which I'm sure are very apparent to a lot of us sitting here today, between universalist human rights frameworks and the relational collective dimensions of Indigenous self-determination. And we're going to have a bit of a discussion about constitutional systems and, well, really constitutional transformation to honour both of these things. So Claire is going to invite you as participants to consider what transformation could look like when Indigenous rights are treated not as a moral afterthought, but as the foundation for legitimate governance and a flourishing pluralist democracy. Oh, yeah. So I'm looking forward to today. I just also thought it was good to meet Claire the person, and I'll let her introduce herself and really just give you a bit of a background as to how she came to be involved in this work. So no mai, Claire, lovely to see you again. I hope you're safe and sound in Ōtautahi, and looking forward to going and seeing your son later on this afternoon. So yeah, no mai, kia ora, kei a koe.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Waiau, ko Ngāti Whakau e te iwi, ko Claire Charters tuku ingoa. I am a professor of law at the University of Auckland, and I've been involved in this mahi for, I guess, since 1997, when I was involved in the elaboration and drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I think Kym referred to as UNDRIP, and we do colloquial, but there's a lot of acronyms to get our heads around in the UN system. So some of the mahi that we do as at the University of Auckland includes advocacy on behalf of Indigenous peoples, but mainly that is as a support role. I've also worked with the National Iwi Chairs Forum, their potikanga, in their representations at the international level. So just by way of introduction, I think it's really important to understand that at the international level, at the under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it would, in the New Zealand context, to realise those rights, mean fundamental constitutional transformation, as Kym mentioned. And that is especially because of the right to self-determination, which is the key and central right in that Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And to realise that in the Aotearoa context, I certainly can't see our current system, which really centres on parliamentary sovereignty, that the state, the Crown, has absolute sovereignty. So there's very little space, at least formally, but also I think at a practical level, just around the margins to realise that self-determination. So we would need something quite fundamental. Some of the challenges, just by way of introduction, facing the United Nations and the international legal order are probably well known to all of you. And that includes the threat to international law in general and the international legal order that we're seeing currently. So that includes the potential breach of international law of the incursions both into Venezuela and into Iraq as well, because there is not anything in the constitutional foundation of the United Nations, the UN Charter, that would authorise that. And there's nothing also in international law outside of that UN Charter, that UN Constitution, that can be applied to that situation. So we have all of those two situations at the very least, including also, I guess, Ukraine we have to include in there as well as potentially other conflicts. So there is that challenge to the international legal order. Another thing on the ground at the United Nations, which might not sound as problematic as it actually is the UN's financial crisis. And that is because states, especially the US has been in the press for that, are not paying their dues to the UN. And that goes back to that question of legitimacy and legality. That means that the UN is struggling to function. And it goes to the extent of when I was in Geneva in the expert mechanism last year, they didn't have the air conditioning on despite it being in the 30s. They are really trying to save money, and that's sort of a ridiculous example, but to say that the UN doing its work, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, doesn't have funding to go to places to review Indigenous rights implementation and so on. So that's a big one. Then there's the perception, I think, about what use is the UN, and that's I guess a perception that's always been there, or a question that's always been there. But I think given the context of these, wars, conflicts, that's become even as a greater question, I guess. So, looking internationally, the other thing I wanted to point out as a second matter at the outset is that there are movements on implementation of Indigenous peoples' rights in various domestic contexts. They include, for example, Botswana, which has recently formally recognised that Indigenous peoples, San peoples, for example, exist in their territories. A lot of African states historically have denied that there are Indigenous peoples. They've claimed that everybody is original to those territories and so on. Mexico, we've seen dramatic constitutional foundation. There has always been a right to self-determination in the Constitution since 2001. But under the new constitutional reforms of the last year or so, they're recognised as what is called as a public entity. So that means they are recognised as a third sovereign, effectively, with rights to taxpayer funding to regulate and themselves. So that is quite a big move. In Chile, for example, we see the courts implementing, because it's consistent with their constitution, what's called the ILO, International Labour Organization, Convention 169 on Indigenous peoples. As I mentioned, that is permitted for the courts to do that and to implement those rights under Chilean constitutional law. But the impact has been, this is debated, I guess, but from our perspective, it looks a lot more progressive, is a lot of focus on the need for free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples before there's development in Chile. So that's been quite strong. Finally, just want to mention Canada, where they have legislation now, both in British Columbia and at the federal level, to implement the declaration. They're not scared of this concept of self-determination. In Canada, there's recognition of particular spaces and places on traditional land where Indigenous peoples regulate themselves outside of state regulation. So and the idea is, or expressed in that law, is that legislation will over time, all legislation will have to be amended or reviewed for its consistency with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The third sort of introductory comment that I wanted to make in the first 15 or so minutes was that, what's happening here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that is we saw a movement for a while there to implement the declaration, and that's just saying that over time New Zealand's position is always oscillated. It's always gone back and forth, but there was sort of a higher point. I wouldn't say it was the best thing ever, or the absolute sort of pinnacle of implementation, but there was a movement for implementation and a development of a national plan of action to implement the declaration. And there are many interesting things about that process, but one, that it was at the highest levels, kind of governed by ministers and members of the National Iwi Chairs Forum as well. Now, I don't need to say too much about the current situation with respect to Māori rights under this particular coalition. I think we're all well aware of those developments, and also I'm sure they've been covered in other seminar, which you can access online in the recorded versions. But suffice to say, from an international perspective, there are a lot of Māori at the moment, either as individuals, as representatives of National Iwi Chairs Forum, as representatives of their hapu, of non-governmental organisations, of the iwi at a broader level, of Māori health practitioners, and so on. There's a tremendous amount of Māori engagement in different ways at the UN, and I think that is a result of, and this has always been true to some extent, but has been motivated by our inability to, I guess, push back against this government in legal ways and political ways, because they've been so using their parliamentary sovereignty and the power of the executive to undermine our rights. So the idea that we go outside and look at the right to self-determination, try and put pressure on our government that way. We've seen a few examples of pretty strong rejection of that. So, for example, when the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who has the authority to look into what's happening domestically and try and uphold Indigenous peoples' rights, or work with governments and Indigenous peoples to ensure that, or try and ensure that Indigenous peoples' rights are being respected. So the Special Rapporteur, currently a man called Albert Barume, wrote what's called an allegation letter to the government. An allegation letter is not saying that's the problem. It's saying, I've been hearing these things from Māori. So, detailed those things. So what say you in response, government? So I think particularly David Seymour, who acted out of turn, in fact, and was reprimanded to some extent by Winston Peters as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I think also by the Prime Minister, but wrote back and said, this is just a tremendous incursion into our sovereignty, you know nothing, and the Prime Minister called it bumpkin, but they clearly misunderstood what the allegation letter was, and refused to engage. And that is really embarrassing for Aotearoa, New Zealand, that kind of dialogue around you're interfering with our sovereignty, because on a broader level, New Zealand has always argued that human rights have to be respected around the globe, right? And if other states, and we're thinking of states that we might associate with tremendous human rights abuse, say go away international oversight because of our sovereignty, that's problematic, and we lose our moral authority, obviously, to do that. And in fact, human rights, you have to look at domestically to make sense of them. So I just want to signal, and you will be able to find it online, that recently a very strong collection of rōpū Māori did present before the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, of all forms of racial discrimination, in November last year. And we call it the third committee, another acronym of the many. And that committee came out with a very damning assessment of what's happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, be it from respect for land rights, for revision of our, Foreshore and Seabed Act Mark II, and so on. So that's worth having a look at, and also other reports that we see coming out of the UN. But I'll just because that's the most recent and closest we've got to evaluation of what's happening now, I encourage you to have a look at that report and some of the recommendations. Look, I'll finish it there, and I think now we go into more like a fireside chat with Kym's tough questions that hopefully I can respond to, even if I can't resolve absolutely.
Kia ora, Claire. There was a lot in that for people who might be new to this kind of this space around the international. I guess some of our views have been, ka whawhai tonu mātou ake, the struggle without end, but taking that struggle wherever. And I think often our view has been around, trying to shame the government into being a better treaty partner, being more rights focused, those sorts of things. So I think we have seen that's been our objective in a lot of the things that we've tried to do in terms of our shadow reports on to the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which we've been doing since 2017, I think, or no, longer than that.
As the initial Chairs group, but Māori have been since the 1980s, Moana Jackson. Yeah.
One of the things I guess I was fortunate enough to be at UNDRIP a couple of times, but there was a group that had a commemoration for Descartes, who it was 100 years since he'd been at that time it would have been the League of Nations, but it was coming to the UN to try and get Indigenous self-determination and rights recognised. And I'm aware too that T.W. Ratana did the same thing. Do you kind of, thinking back to the objectives then and now, do you think there's much difference to how we're trying to get in those spaces and what we're trying to achieve? Or do you want to also share about Descartes?
Sure. So just first of all, the UNDRIP is the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and is an entity made up formally of 7 Indigenous experts on the rights of Indigenous peoples, generally always Indigenous, but actually there have been examples of state-appointed experts, and they look at developing law and policy on Indigenous people's rights, to some extent assessing what's going on and trying to support governments in respecting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Going back to Descartes, an interesting one of Descartes' descendants was also there, and she is also very active in the international sphere. So he was raising questions from Turtle Island, from North America. He was raising questions about the lack of respect for sovereignty, for self-determination, as they refer to it now in the international level, and lack of respect for land rights. So pushing back against the state monopoly of international organisations and saying we have to be included because we have these qualities. Do I think there's been advancement since then? Absolutely. And the movement really began in the 1970s and supported by, a UN at that stage. There were some officials who were very amenable to understanding Indigenous rights as different from minority rights, right? That we are self-determining and have our historical sovereignty that we continue to maintain today. And that movement fell out of the American Indian movement and then the Indigenous rights movement globally. And they were very successful, I think, in getting Indigenous peoples in the door. And at some points, they were literally opening the door, literally pushing against the door, mainly made up of that time of North American Turtle Island advocates, to some extent, some Māori as well, earlier on, but not quite at that point. And since then, Indigenous peoples at least have been able to participate in the UN and push our causes. And what was really interesting in the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and very unusual, was that Indigenous peoples had an equal voice to states in that drafting process. And it was clear that that declaration would not get through unless it had some minimal support from Indigenous peoples, or from what was perceived as a kind of a great majority. Consensus would have never been actually possible, I don't think. It then went through another state process to go through the General Assembly and so on to be adopted. But during those actual negotiations, now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is far from perfect. Um, um, but it is an incredible advancement, and we see it filtering down. I mentioned Canada, Mexico, and its constitutional transformation is very much influenced by the international law, in Latin America as a whole, and many of the constitutions, international law, particularly treaties, is binding in those constitutions. Mentioned Chile. We see developments in Africa that I mentioned. We see in some places recognition of Indigenous peoples in Asia, particularly Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, albeit kind of muted. Now, that was not the case prior to this movement, right? And wasn't necessarily the declaration that achieved that, but I think it was the most significant moment. So have we made a difference since Deska has first sort of coming into the UN, and Ratana's trying to grab the attention, say what's happening here is wrong? Absolutely. And the decolonization process of the 60s and 70s still continues to some extent, and we have advocates in Alaska, particularly, in Hawaii, particularly, who, obviously New Caledonia or Kanaki peoples, arguing to be decolonized, as in state out, we want to be independent nations. So that is kind of a separate element, but closely related to Indigenous people's rights. That is still very active, and it's still a platform. And some states have some sympathy with those views.
We've got a question here from, should we, do you want to keep, no, we might just ask the questions as they come. Yeah?
As you mind, I'm happy to run as it
Danny
is.
McLean has asked, what role do you think Aotearoa implementing both Te Tiriti and UNDRIP will have in us realising other key human rights commitments? So I guess the other international instruments like rights of the child, rights of people with disabilities, CEDAW probably as well. And yeah. And her comment is, it feels like these are siloed when they shouldn't be. But I also think maybe a little bit of an extension on Indigenous rights being collective rights versus the individualistic human rights, maybe a bit of an explainer on that.
Okay. Thanks for the pārtai. Tēnā koe. So the first thing I'd say that Kym alluded to is that, at least at the international level, all these human rights instruments, be it you mentioned the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, I mentioned Convention on Racial Discrimination, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and so on. All those human rights are considered to be interconnected and mutually enforcing. Now, in that, international tribunals and so on have been incorporating the declaration into that. And so, for example, in reviewing Aotearoa and against the racial discrimination norms, it's looking very much at the situation of Māori here and saying, well, the declaration has these rights. We understand racial discrimination as a problem when Indigenous peoples are denied their land rights too, right? So they're extending out the understanding of racial discrimination to look at specific issues that, I mean, not exclusively, but specific issues that we have as Indigenous peoples, such as lands, territories, and resources, and self-determination. So how will, if I've understood the question correctly, how will the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples support implementation of other instruments? Well, to some extent, when you realise Indigenous people's rights, you are also realising other rights, other human rights, right? So, for example, freedom from discrimination. So they are all tied in together. So that would support implementation of other human rights. Kym, you referred to, and I think it's a really important subject, is human rights as collective rights. Historically, when I was at law school, we refer to first generation human rights, and they were the very individualistic rights, particularly civil and political rights, right to life, right to freedom of association. Those rights were considered the core rights and very individualistically focused. So you have the right as an individual. That included also at that point economic and social rights, like you as an Indigenous peoples have, as a person, individual, irrespective of whether you're Indigenous or not or racial group, have the right to health, for example. Now, Indigenous peoples, in arguing for Indigenous peoples' rights, really were pushing the boundary of human rights by saying that they should include collective rights. Now, there are many arguments for that, but one of the key ones is this concept of human dignity, right, which is meant to underpin human rights internationally or globally, domestically as well. This concept of human dignity that and Indigenous peoples argued, well, to respect our human dignity, you also need to, within the human rights frame, recognise our collective rights to our lands, territories, and resources, and that we own and have and hold those rights as a peoples, but especially the right to self-determination, that we have the collective right to something like in legal terms, we refer it to jurisdiction, but the right to regulate ourselves, our own territories, and so on. There was a right to self-determination in some of the first human rights conventions and covenants that came out in the 60s, but trying to apply those to the Indigenous people setting so that we hold those rights as collective. As in, the collective was not just all the people or the individuals within a state, but also self-determination and peoples existed within states, especially in the case of Indigenous peoples. So we have pushed out the boundaries of human rights. Those tensions still remain. Fundamentally, that the kind of Seymour line, the ACT line of one person, one vote. You treat everybody the same. Right? Everybody has exactly the same rights. Is that original kind of first generation rights, right? That what matters is the individual, without taking into account history, colonization, poverty statistics, or
the gang patch ban.
for example, so that is just a very a contextual understanding, not taking into account that Māori amongst and also our Pacifica friends and relations sit at the bottom of all these things. So the international movement has moved on and focused on substantive equality more generally, but all these things wax and wane as well, and you still get France, for example, is very allowed in the international forum of saying, well, these are individual rights still, but they are now more or less in the minority. So
do you think that comes because they are a settler colonial state?
I can't speak for France. I don't, but from what I've seen in these contexts, so for example, in the drafting of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for those 10 years that I was there, it's a philosophical basis. It's something very French, based on philosophy that comes out of very significant and important philosophical foundations under the French Revolution, and that kind of culture doesn't matter. It comes out of, I think, pressures within France from immigration as well, from their French colonies. So Paris, for example, was an incredibly multicultural place, and I think there's pushback against that, but then to say, they just have rights as French citizens, we don't recognize that maybe they come from one of the former French colonies where, you know, um, they organize themselves differently and tribes are insignificant and groupings are significant. So they want to sort of say that that's not relevant. You see it in the Tahitian context, you see it in the Kanaki context as well. They can't accept that or do not accept that there can be a Kanaki-based, government within New Caledonia, and pushes very much against that French, at least state narrative, right? So I think there's lots of, I'm no expert in France. I can just kind of repeating my impressions having sat in the room and hearing their arguments.
We've got another question here from Chris, Morena Chris. He's read up on He Puapua, so this is about He Puapua. What would need to be considered for a future government to reinstate, I guess, UNDRIP, the National Plan of Action, He Puapua, or something similar, and to bring the country along with updated legislation? And, how might this best be done? I think,
Yeah.
Chris, we all have to join hands together. We need a critical mass and we need to vote well. But anyway, that aside, Claire.
Oh yeah, hard questions. As I said, I'm not necessarily got answers to these questions, but I can, I guess make some comments on it. And just, I would say about He Puapua and the reaction against an implementation process around the declaration was, it was unfortunate, and partly that's because I think it was grabbed by the opposition. It kind of been kept a little bit under wraps by Labour, and they then lost kind of control of it, and then this tremendous misunderstanding built up about what it meant. The arguments about apartheid and separatism that Judith Collins was putting out there. So it was really unfortunate that it came out, that narrative. Well, that's how it was kind of sold by the opposition for raw political purposes to which was a bit sad, because that's not what it was really about. What would be needed to get it back on the table? I think Kym's 100% right. And you mentioned that we need to bring the nation along with us, right? We have to understand, I think, that respect for rights as Māori means that, well, there's so many things to say here. We've got to address all those horrible statistics around, poverty, homelessness, and so on. But in a bigger sense, we need to recognise those treaty rights to sovereignty, tino rangatiratanga, for Māori to feel included properly, I think, in the state of Aotearoa, New Zealand. While at that very basic and fundamental level, our tino rangatiratanga is not respected, what attachment do you really have to the New Zealand project, right? So it's a good thing, I think, to create that cohesiveness, in part through that recognition of our rights and dealing with the impact of colonization on us. That has been profound, and we see that every day. I am going to say something that might not be as that can be questioned, but at least and might be biased given the circles that I move in. But I do sense that this current government has helped the cause in some ways, because there are a bunch of people that might not normally be the strongest advocates of Indigenous people's rights who have just said, look, this has gone way too far. Like, it has been a galvanizing force, I think, with some of those people that sit in the middle, right? And just said, look, we are a proud nation, proud of our record on Indigenous people's rights. I think I think that is overstated. But my hope is, yes, you do need a change of government, and we need to vote wisely. I think that's right. But potentially we also need to be you're kind of supporting the state system to achieve some change, but change in order to recognize to some extent Aotearoa rangatiratanga. I think this is my project, and and something that I bang on about all the time, is that we have to realize that in Western liberal democracies, that recognition of Indigenous people's sovereignty and self-determination has been a good thing. In Canada, for example, the recognition of territories where Indigenous peoples have, and in the US actually, have greater control, have led to positive outcomes economically, health outcomes, education outcomes. So that this is a
Environmental.
good thing, environmental outcomes. And this has been proved over 50 years of research coming out of Harvard, something called the Harvard Project on Indigenous Self-Determination and Government. Have a look at it. It's fascinating. And, we need to understand, our government needs to understand that, treating us all the same and getting rid of the Māori Health Authority is going in the wrong direction, empirically, as a matter of fact, looking at other liberal democracies, right? That information has to get out there.
I
That
mean, I
Mexico
think,
is doing
yeah.
this around self-determination, that, there is this movement in some places that, that hasn't been, the state hasn't failed. There hasn't been this, apartheid thing happening. It's just this fear and fear mongering, I think, happening.
Yeah, I think you can see it in Kura Kaupapa Māori education as well. Our students that are in there do better than they do in
Right.
mainstream, and it doesn't take anything away from those who choose to be in mainstream, but it's an alternative that's really important. I think one of the things and I wish I'd done this earlier in our kōrero, was just acknowledging, we've been working together for a while in this mahi e hoa, and supporting Papa Moana Jackson,
Mhm.
um, and sharing his knowledge and his views around how we can achieve constitutional transformation. And, I guess some of the things that I'm thinking about as we go through this is I'd really like us to maybe have an opportunity to focus on how amazing we are in terms of Indigenous rights rather than we all hate the government.
Yeah.
The other thing I also want to reflect on is when you responded to that question, I think in the last few years, since we've had this coalition government, I've had so many people come up to me and say, kia ora, deliberately. And also things like, I'm a tangata Tiriti. That has become part of our, day-to-day, terminology. So, I feel like that's been a radical change, which has been driven by maybe some of the negative political stuff that's been going on. So I guess to I don't know if we want to just segue somehow a little less clumsily than I'm doing it, but one of the things I have gotten a lot out of when I've participated in the international forums, actually, there's a couple of things I want to talk about, is really around the sovereign, the solidarity, getting ideas, sharing resources, information, and feeling part of a broader movement. But the other thing too, I do want to talk about is when we failed to have that national plan of action for UNDRIP, we did receive some funding as iwi chairs from government to implement an education program. It was meant to be called the Whānau Rangatiratanga Project, which was looking at working with collectives of Māori in communities. It happened just after Cyclone Gabriel and the flooding in Auckland. And we trained 60 facilitators, and they were meant to deliver, rangatiratanga plans, help people understand their rights as well. And then we were meant to do 500. I think we did 820. And we've got 44 amazing people who are very, very active and who have good understanding about how to genuinely facilitate these discussions. Even in the National Plan of Action, we did that targeted engagement where people were getting more au fait with talking about these things. So, I guess it's like we've got the law over there. We're not seeing a lot of regard for the law. What can we do collectively together, and how can we kind of bring it into applied knowledge? How can we practice it? There's a lot there. Sorry.
There's a lot in there. I'm taking some, so I'm just going to start from the beginning. So you mentioned Kura Kaupapa. So what I found particularly in the kura that the immersion kura that my kids have been through, Hipera and Max, is that increasingly we are seeing, Pākehā with no whakapapa Māori coming into those kura. And it's for our kura, it's been a tricky thing to manage, right? Because you want to, and also at the law school, and also at the university with te reo, right? People who want to learn te reo, do we prioritize our whakapapa Māori, or do we open things up? So, and partly that's because of that, that understanding that we do better, but than going through mainstream English medium. But, it goes to that point that you're making about people are coming up and feeling a stronger relationship with as tangata tiriti. You mentioned Moana and Jackson, and he is our leader in this field. He was engaged, not quite the first, but um, you had and alongside people like Nana Minhinnick and Aroha Mead and so on, but very much a leader in this field and a leader internationally. He chaired the Indigenous Peoples Caucus at moments in time at the UN level and so on. And his positivity around constitutional transformation, that we take our time, we work with people. I remember he was saying that he was going to a Rotary Club to talk many years ago, that it is about going back to those, shifting the nation as a whole and as a collective, but to keep plodding on. There might be backward steps but also forward steps. And one of the things that Moana did just before he died, when he knew he didn't have so much time to go, is he wrote to various people with sort of an encouragement. And so the one that he wrote to me was, around keep up the mahi at the international level. It's important to have that solidarity and you will make progress. That very inspiring kind of and as I said, I know that he wrote those emails to various people around the place. And I think that's important. And, you have to have, on that note, you have to have a long-term objective of using these norms, right, at the international level. You'll often get a pushback, like we did to the report on the committee of the report of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the pushback against the special rapporteur's role. But over time, step by step, we have seen a few more people know about the declaration, a few more people refer to the declaration when defending our treaty rights under Te Tiriti or Waitangi. The government is embarrassed, that fact of embarrassment, that fact of losing moral authority in the international sphere. I mean, how can you stand there and defend women's rights when you're sort of, you're also saying human rights don't matter with respect to Indigenous peoples? Those things do impact the government. They do care. And, I did, in my PhD research, I looked a lot at sort of anthropological assessments, empirical assessments of movements within states to better respect human rights. And that is that it's an up and down process, right? And the more embarrassed states are, the more movement you're likely to see sort of in 10 years later, right? That is just a step on the way. So finally, and maybe, you mentioned the solidarity of the Indigenous movement, and, one of the functions, actually, that sounds terribly clinical. One of the really positive aspects of participating in the international level is that sense of solidarity. Kind of always being the person who is arguing for these things can be super taxing. I had an experience yesterday in our executive meeting at the law school where we had the lowest intake of Māori that we've had for well over a decade, right? And we do have mechanisms. We have what's called we've got a process that allows us to have Indigenous Māori come in who might not have the same grade point average as others, right? So it's an interview process and so on. But the main problem was that one course had been marked very low, right? So even despite our process that we have for our tauira Māori, we couldn't get them in because they hadn't met our minimum standard because there'd been so many that had failed or got below a C plus, right? So there wasn't an understanding with the faculty that when you skew things south, that we are disproportionate, that the curve generally goes like this. Our curve, I don't know how that comes out, I might be wrongly displayed, is lower. So we can't get them in. And what they're not factoring in as well into that is once we have them in our Kawita Māori and we can wrap around them with our particular programs, their pass rates are just as high, or just, they might come in with a lower GPA, but they end up getting just their pass rates. So, so I'm having a fight again about that, and you've got people who are a bit stunned, you've got someone pushing back, and that's tiring doing that in so many different contexts. And I'm just using that as one example because, so that going then to the UN sort of context, when you've literally in the permanent forum, at least you've got thousands of Indigenous peoples who are arguing for these rights, who have had similar experiences, who, or, it might be another thing, it is a real balm. Like, I'm not going crazy in this, I'm not going, and I do need to stand up. I shouldn't just go too hard, and oh well, that was a bad year, that you should. So that's really significant. And that's, about my own personal experience. But as a movement, it keeps things pushing along. It's not perfect though. Going to the permanent forum is like is a zoo. Like everyone's fighting to get on the floor and I want to speak then and I want to speak then, and it's not all, roses, but it can be incredibly important to keep the movement going and, you know,
I mean,
on a
in
personal
some
level.
ways, I think, those forums, you get a 2-minute intervention or whatever. So,
Yeah.
whatever. It's a matter
Perfectly.
of record. That's that. But it's really like for me, meeting people, members of the International Indian Treaty Council, people from South America, people from across the Pacific who, and having these discussions about what are we doing? How can we support? How can we build kind of our capability
Mm.
to, look, even I think last time we talked about, how can we do an UNDRIP report as a Pacific region,
Mm.
and we'll rank the governments,
Yeah.
what's the race to the bottom or something, so I think there are ways in which we can work. And I think too, we don't share enough, I believe, with our whanaunga across the ditch in
Mm.
Australia. I think we could be doing
Mm.
a lot more work together. And
Mm.
sometimes I look over there very jealously at some of the things that are happening there, especially at the moment. And yeah, I don't know, but I think like yeah, our people are amazing, and I really applaud people like yourself, Claire, but also some of the young ones that are coming through
Yeah.
who are taking a risk, building confidence, making connections, staying connected, and keeping that dialogue going. And really, I often think that these things are in these forums, we're just continuing our ancestors' kōrero, the
Yeah.
same things our tipuna said, that conversation is continuing. Um, so we do have a question here. I don't know if you can decline it because I did want us to get a bit positive, but it was about the self-determination theory by Richard Ryan and Edward Deci. Are you familiar with that?
No, no, but let me.
Okay, well, let's not talk about that then, because somebody's pissed off because when you Google self-determination, apparently their individualistic white man theory comes up. It's probably a bit like the bell curve book and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, but I wonder, like, what are the things that we can do, I guess, on a practical level here in Aotearoa? Obviously, this webinar series is incredible. It's a real highlight for people to get their kete filled. Um, what are some other things that we can do here?
Yeah. Um, Okay, I'm going to take that bit by bit as well too. So looking over the ditch and working together. I mean, Australia's not really the model of implementation of Indigenous people's rights, nor are we. But the Victoria has just recently signed a treaty um, with Indigenous peoples in Victoria. And, far from perfect as well, but it's provides some baseline recognition of self-determination and sovereignty. In practical terms, what that actually means in terms of participation and authority is a question, but things like that are happening, and that is pretty interesting. On the point of youth coming through, I see it is so heartening because I am a bit jaded, and your views, you do become relatively more conservative. Sorry, you try not to be, but so it's awesome to see youth coming through and have got different visions. I think our now really strong, movement around tangata Te Tiriti comes from movement of our youth, right? I mean, we've always been banging on about it, but I think this sort of, upswing and that understanding comes from our youth who are then taking that internationally. Um, so, it's so inspiring through. And I even see as an advocate, but also as working within a law school, that it's a responsibility of us who are a little bit older, as I think Moana did for me and Tracy Whare and others when we were coming through. It's we have a responsibility to tautoko people coming through. And, sometimes that can come in different ways, right? To support the arguments and so on, but also sometimes to say, hang on, either kind of here's some advice on how to do it. It's a bit like being on a marae and being told off by the aunties, right? Like, if you turn up here, you need to, you can't just rock up. You have to have done the mahi at home.
Your te tautanga.
Yeah, you have to have done exactly. You have to have done the mahi at home. You have to be representing a voice that is not just your own, for
Mhm.
example, right? Um, you have to have that representative kind of quality. You can't speak for Māori unless you have that, or a hapu or one. And so, it's important for us to remind people of that too, or on really practical levels, saying, as soon as the table opens to make a statement, be there. That
Mm.
very practical stuff as well. Um, yeah. So yes, it's our responsibility to support coming through, but it's also a responsibility to guide a little bit on the kaupapa and the protocol and the kawa and the tikanga of those spaces.
Tuakana Taina works every
Yep.
time.
Yeah.
Um, I was just thinking, like, I was a bit of grumpy auntie and took a few crews over to, well, was grumpy auntie with a few crews that went over to Geneva, and those were so rewarding for me, and the ways they thought about things, gaining confidence to kind of go up to people who were,
Yes.
chiefly representatives or
Yes.
international representatives. I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think a lot of our rangatahi seem to be coming in through the climate
Yes.
field as
Absolutely.
well.
Absolutely.
And I guess maybe a good wrap up here might be around the indivisible health, land, environmental, the indivisible rights that exist around that, and how you know, um, even gender rights, rainbow rights, like I think we did have Larissa Wall really pushed for a rainbow rights session at MRIP a few years back, which was the first time it had been discussed. And obviously it was a bit of a struggle, particularly with some of the nations who were very Christian, Catholic kind of oriented, maybe. But it was great. And there are a lot of Two-Spirit people who are involved in the movement as well. So, I guess, yeah, maybe an explanation about you've got to be here for all of the things and be able to understand, I guess, intersectionality.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of a wrap around that.
Again, I'm not sure I can kind of provide any answers, but I mean, I agree with you. Absolutely, Kim. I think that's a really important point. Kind of jumping across to the context that you raised was particularly in the climate movement. And, for very obvious reasons, our rangatahi Māori are very focused on, as youth generally, as again, for it's facing a global, catastrophe, particularly for our younger generations. That's where a lot of focus has been, and that's been the entry into this international sphere. And as you say, talking about indivisible rights, those arguments that were made for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are informing their approach to the climate movement, right? And, there are ways in which the Indigenous movement differs from the movement as a whole. So kind of on a domestic level, there's a lot of interest in our legal personhood, of Te Uruwera, of Whanganui River, other examples also. But what, globally, and we've got at the law school a bunch of academics who are coming in all the time wanting to study this as a rights of nature movement, right? But what they learn very quickly is this is, in our context, it's not a rights of nature movement per se, or a climate change response to try and kaitiaki our atua in the form of forests or whatever. It's about recognizing our rights to tino rangatiratanga, and that's a different starting point than just, better conservation or trying to respond to climate change. And it's those perspectives that are very important. The value of traditional knowledge in responding to climate change, and the value of community, which we've seen in various different marae and various different iwi here. So there's a real Indigenous perspective that can draw on the Declaration. And there's this idea that the international law policy should be integrated in that way. And I think very much movements around our Two-Spirit people and our Indigenous ways of incorporating our Two-Spirit people and ensuring that there is manaakitanga and kaitiakitanga of our people. I think that does inform our approach. The fact that we've got collective rights, I think, supports that. And, there are human rights special rapporteurs who look at the climate movement, who are seeing the human rights.
I've just been given a ding ding. We need to wrap it up in like
cool.
1 minute.
Okay,
So
cool.
quick concluding comments.
But I would say also that the Indigenous movement is stretched at the moment. We used to all be focused under the human rights banner, right, for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now we're in climate change. Now we're in health. Now we're in, I don't know, like just kind of everywhere, and World Bank trying to ensure that their policies, we're all over the shop, which we have to be, but equally it makes it difficult to have a cohesive movement as well. We just sometimes don't know. I don't know often what's happening in the climate change movement until I watch the seminar here and go, oh, that's what you're doing, or I have a chat to somebody at some hui. So that having that cohesion within the movement is challenged by all the different issues we're trying to be across. Because we used to be millions, one fora, mainly in human rights.
Thank you, Claire. Sorry to cut you off.
No, it's fine. I understand.
Hey, thank you everybody who's zoomed in. Thank you for your comments in the chat and your questions. Thank you to all the volunteers and partners who have helped bring this event to life. Relevant announcements. So there are some partner events happening. Obviously, there's the event that's not listed there is get out, enroll, and vote, please. And make sure all your whānau do too. Vote well, vote wisely. And the recordings will be uploaded to YouTube over the next few weeks and can be shared widely for those who haven't registered or you've missed out, you've been too busy, I don't know, at the grindstone doing your work. So just ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa, e hara taku toa he toa takitahi, engari taku toa he toa takitini. Thank you so much, Claire. Mauri ora, kia piki te ora, he pukinga koe, mauri ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa.